Missed. Well, at least one of you.
Don't overdo it.
I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to leave it at that point. So, we're going to, as I said, we're going to finish up chapter 2 today. And one of the best ways to look at this, I think, is the way that Chuck Swindoll kind of laid it out in terms of an outline he did for Philippians. And you'll notice the repetition of joy, 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 not only in the outline, but throughout the book. This is Paul's book of joy. It's going to be very different, as we've talked about, and we've already seen, from most of the other books. In fact, we're only going to deal with one point, a couple points in chapter 2, where we'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges for the church. But the rest of the church is almost it's a thank you note to begin with for the Philippians supporting him while he's under house arrest. But if you look at the second chapter, joy in serving Christ in unity, starts with the right attitude, maintained through right theology, and encouraged by right models. We're going to see all of those today. Last week, we finished up the like-minded section, which is one of our focal points. The rest of this week, the rest of today, are going to be servanthood, which you'll see in verses 6 through 8. Every knee shall bow, one way or another. And I've got a quote from C.S. Lewis that I think you'll enjoy. Work out your salvation. This isn't work out in terms of figure it out. It is work out in terms of it's a workout to do what it is Christ demands of you. And then finally, the last piece of that is some right models in Timothy and Epaphroditus. So let's pick up in servanthood. And in verses, starting in verse 5 and going through 5 through 8 and then further on through 9 through 11, the verses present probably one of the most significant statements in all of Scripture on the nature of the incarnation, the fact that God became man. Also, in this description, we're going to see the vivid illustration of Christ's humanity. So there's two pieces to this puzzle. The first is verses 6 through 8, which is the servanthood. And then we're going to get to the point of, from that point, what happens in its exaltation, which is verses 9 through 11. This likely was an early hymn, and most of your Bibles probably have this in poetic form. Very unusual for Paul. Not much of Paul is written in poetic form. He does much, much more in prose. So if he's doing this in poetic form, it's because he's wanting to stress it. And furthermore, if it was an early hymn, he's taken the words of the early hymn in order to demonstrate what the incarnation was. So I just want to read verses, we're going to start in verse 5 and read through 11, and you're going to see both servanthood and exaltation. And you'll be easy to recognize because you're going to see one of Paul's great words, therefore, and that's when we'll ask what it's there for. So start out with me in verse 5. Your attitude, this is chapter 2, your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on the cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of the Father. As I said, probably one of the most profound and significant statements on the incarnation. And I want to make some points about it because we tend to think that, Jesus left his godship and came to the earth as man and then went back. That's not exactly what happens. So start with me in verse 6. Christ's pre-incarnate state is stated here. And there's two assertions made. He was first in the very nature God, literally in the form of God, and he did not regard his existence in the manner of equality with God. So the two points is it was in very nature God, but he did not consider equality with God as a prize to be grasped or held onto. In other words, he was prepared to leave his status as God in order to become man. And then verse 7 really hits it. Made himself of no reputation. The phrase can be translated, he emptied himself. You may have something similar to that in your versions. I want to point out that Christ did this by taking on the form of a servant, a mere man. But in doing so, he did not empty himself of any part of his essence as God. In other words, he was both, and that's why quite often you'll see the expression God-man. He was both at the same time, both simultaneously. Indeed, he merely gave up his privileges as God and took upon himself existence as a man while remaining completely God. He became completely human. One of the things we've talked about several times in terms of the Gnostics was the Gnostics denied that. The Gnostics said that if it is material, in other words, if it is the body, it can't possibly be good. Therefore, Jesus could not possibly have been fully man and fully God at the same time because the body was something corporal. That was the primary thought of the Gnostics, and that's why you end up with so many thoughts of Gnosticism saying that Christ was simply an appearance of, dokeo, an appearance of, or seemed to be what man saw on earth. Instead, so he gave up his privilege as God and took on the existence of man. In the very same verse, look in verse 7, because that's probably the key verse to the servanthood part. He made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant. King James is the very form or nature. Jesus added to his divine essence a servant's essence. That is essentially the characteristics of a human being seeking to fulfill the will of another. And the term in the King James is probably better. He talks about a bondservant. Bondservant was the lowest form of servant that there could possibly be, and there were a number of different ranges of servanthood in Roman provinces at the time. Paul does not say that Christ exchanged the form of God for the form of a servant, involving a loss of deity and the attributes. Rather, in the incarnation, Christ continued in the very nature of God, but added to himself the nature of a servant. And as I said, bondservant, in this context, refers to the lowest status in the social ladder. It's going to be the exact opposite term of when we get to Lord further on. So he'd choose to add to his person the nature of a servant. And then in verse 8, and being found in appearance as a man. This is the third word that Paul's going to use to show Philippians that Jesus Christ, who is fully God from all eternity, is also fully man. I want you to listen to the three words. First of all, the nature, then the likeness, then the appearance. Paul's making the case that this is, when continues to make the case, this is both God and man. So Jesus came to earth with the identity of man, and here the word appearance points to the external characteristics of Jesus. He had the beings, actions, and manners of a man. Why would that be necessary? It'd be pretty tough for us to identify with something different, wouldn't it? Isn't it pretty easy to identify? How many times have we said something like, there, but for the grace of God go I, and we're talking about something that somebody else is facing? How difficult is it to relate to something other than human beings? How difficult would it be for me to relate to Ian if I were something different? Only possibility for that relationship would have been for fully God to become fully man. Again, a huge issue in the early church in terms of what the Gnostics taught. And then it goes on to talk about humbling himself. So, and then becoming obedient. Although he never sinned, did not deserve to die, he chose to die so that the sins of the world could be charged to his account. Subsequently, he could credit his righteousness to the account of all who believe in him. If we go all the way back to the Old Testament, we begin to look at the sacrificial system during the Old Testament. There were two requirements for sacrifice in the Old Testament. One was that, and again, you'll see kind of substitutionary atonement here. In the Old Testament, the sacrifice had to first of all be blemishless. In other words, there had to be no defect. The second thing was there had to be a shedding of blood in order for there to be a acceptance of the sacrifice. So it was simply a picture of what was going to happen in the New Testament. First of all, the sacrifice, in this case in human form. This is the only sacrifice. I can't say that because there were human sacrifices in the Old Testament, but this is the only sacrifice in the name of God Yahweh that is fully human and also spotless or without defect. So the sacrifice, first of all, met both of those requirements. But then I want you to look at one other thing it says here. Even the death on the cross. Well, the reason that's significant is this is the most, in Roman time, the death on the cross, crucifixion, was reserved for only the worst of the worst. In other words, the Romans believed, and there was only several reasons that it could be done, one of which was insurrection. None of that was ever proved at the trial. You might recall that Pilate says, his blood is on your hands. None of that's ever true and never proven in the trial, but the crucifixion of Christ came about as a result of the Jews asking for the release of Barabbas. Well, so now we have the perfect sacrifice who shed blood, and in the most heinous of ways possible. In fact, in Judaism, to be hung on a tree was to be equated with the most sinful of the sinners. That's exactly what happened. It was equated with the most sinful of the sinners. In other words, us, but was sinless. So, the cross then would have been the worst possible way to do this. And then we get finally to verse 9. You notice in verse 9, what's the very first word? Therefore. So, as with all of Paul's writings, look at what happens before and after that. So, therefore, God exalted him. I want you to note the contrast between Jesus placing himself in a debased status with God the Father's elevation of Jesus to the highly exalted status. So, beginning in verse 9, we get the antithesis of God as man, and we get now God as being exalted. Jesus is being exalted. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name above all names. That's going to take us to our next key verse here. Every knee should bow. Every indicates a universal acknowledgement of Christ's sovereignty, even by his enemies. Paul doesn't imply universal salvation by what he's saying here, but means that every personal being will ultimately confess Christ's lordship. I want you to think about that. Every human being will ultimately confess Christ's lordship, either with joyful faith or with resentment and despair. Think through that for just a minute. Now I want to read you a quote from C.S. Lewis that I think puts it in perfect context. C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Weight of Glory in 1942. In fact, most of C.S. Lewis, well, I can't say his writings, but he had a radio show at the same time. This is all during World War II. And in his writings and in his radio show was always about, you might think that things are the bleakest now, but they are not. Here's what he says in The Weight of Glory. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilization, these are mortal. And their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals who we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Mortal horrors or everlasting splendors. In other words, C.S. Lewis is saying, one way or another, every knee will bow. It's either going to bow in adoration and submission, or it's going to bow in recognition of, holy smokes, this was right, and I'm on the wrong side of it. Yep. In verse 11, after he says every knee shall bow, the term confess in the King James, it's acknowledge in the NIV. The term Paul uses is a strong intensive verb, which means to agree with or say the same thing. Essentially, Paul is saying that everyone will unanimously affirm what God the Father has already stated, and that is Jesus Christ is Lord. And again, C.S. Lewis says it probably better than anybody else. We will either be immortal horrors or everlasting wonders. Those are the choices.
And it's amazing, like every knee shall bow, including the unsaved, including the people.
Exactly.
Don't most religions in the world recognize Jesus as a way to God?
No.
No?
No. Islam, as an example, recognizes him a teacher. Certainly doesn't recognize him as the son of Allah.
But I know the Buddhists do.
Buddhists might.
Teacher.
Yeah.
As a teacher.
I don't know if they well, first of all, I guess you'd have
It's a
to.
way. I mean, it's not the,
Yep.
their primary, but they recognize him.
Yep. Most of them do recognize him, but I can't think of many that recognize him as the way. Certainly not, I guess I would rephrase that to say, certainly not as the only way. Christianity is the only one that does that. Ultimately, Judaism may too, but Judaism has yet to say that the Messiah has appeared.
I think most religions recognize that Jesus existed, but they look at him as a prophet or a teacher, like Elijah, not the Son of God. Is that right?
Yep, I think that's accurate.
When he wrote this letter to the Philippians, did he mail the letter? Did he write it when he was with him? Did he have it delivered?
Okay,
Do you know?
I do, because it tells us, but not until a later chapter. But we'll do a what do they call it when they tell you the story before? Oh, before you watch the movie. Spoiler, yeah, it's a spoiler alert. It's delivered by Epaphroditus, who we're going to read about here in a little bit. All of these letters are delivered at one point or another. The majority of them actually are going to be delivered at one time. The letter to the Ephesians, Colossians, and one of the prison letters is called Philemon, are all delivered by Tychicus, probably around 60 A.D. The reason they are, we'll go look at the map of it here in just a minute, is that they're all kind of congregated in one area.
Right.
Philippi is in a very different area. So the first thing we need to recognize is Paul is writing these all under house arrest, and likely all probably within the same time period. In fact, you've probably seen some similarities between Ephesians and Colossians. There are certainly Galatians. I should point out, Galatians is not one of the prison letters. The reason we did Galatians is because there's so many lessons for today's churches there. The rest of the books we've looked at are what are called prison letters. The one we won't look at is Philemon. Philemon is the letter that deals completely with slavery and releasing Onesimus, his slave, who was with Paul at the time, under house arrest back to Philemon. So all of them are written roughly the same time, call it 60, and they're all going to be delivered in a relatively short period of time. The likelihood is they were delivered and then preached as a sermon and then left with the church. Now, they also become what are called circular letters. In other words, in fact, when you Look at Colossians. It says, share your letter with the church at Hierapolis, or share your letter and let them share theirs with you. So there's likely even more than this, Keith, that get delivered. So here, what we see is kind of in the prison letters, we see kind of an example of how they were probably done. Paul is in chains, as you can see here. Whoever is taking the notes would become Paul's recording secretary, and the big fancy word is an amanuensis, and then they're going to be delivered by people who are with Paul. Epaphroditus is the most likely candidate, and Paul tells us when we get to chapter 4.
You know what's interesting too is like, if you want to dig into Philippians today, there's concordances, you can buy books about Philippians to like understand the chapter or the book more. And these guys are getting this letter fresh with nothing else but to read it, right? They can't be like, oh, well, let's buy this study guide for it and sit together on Tuesday. Right? It's raw.
That's a good point. They can't go say, let's go look up Barclay's reference on this and see what he has to say about it, right?
Can you Google this? What does it say online about? Right? Like, we have so much, and then of course it's 2,000 years later, so it's been read by a bajillion people, and people write books about it, there's been sermons about it and all that. They were the first people to get it. So they were like, obviously they didn't have the understanding of it. You went 2,000 years with all these additional tools to read it.
It's probably even a little more difficult for the church at Philippi. And the reason for that is, we talked about this earlier, there are no Jews in the church at Philippi. This is the most Gentile church that Paul founds. The reason we know that is when we're first introduced to the church at Philippi and in the second missionary journey, in almost every other case, you'll read Paul went into the synagogue and he preached almost every other case. But when you get to Philippi, what does it say? On Sabbath, Paul went outside the city gates and went down by the river where he met Lydia and a number of others. What that tells us is there weren't 10 righteous men in Philippi, 10 righteous Jewish men in Philippi in order to form a synagogue. So now the church, the letter back to the Philippians, by the way, there are no quotes. I think we mentioned this before. There are no quotes of the Old Testament in the letter to the Philippians. They wouldn't have known what to do with it. So the church at Philippi is primarily a Gentile church. So it's got to be even, you'd have to think in some degree, it's got to be even more difficult for them because they have no background in what the Old Testament was. They have no background in who even God Yahweh was. In fact, the Philippian church was most likely very pagan in its beliefs. Epaphroditus, who delivers the letter, his name comes from Aphrodite. So he would have been a pagan believer. But ultimately, he's going to be here with Paul. And we'll come to that. Well, in fact, we'll get to that at the end of this chapter.
They had no historical connection at all as to what took place at all.
No.
Just think of the news, like it's not, if there's something going on in the war in Ukraine, we can see it live on video today. And so this was how many years after Jesus died?
Well, if we're at 60, most people will put Jesus' death between 30 and 33. So let's take 30. That means it's 30 years later.
So would they have even heard about Jesus at all? I mean, from the former church, I suppose they had.
Well, yes. The church at Philippi, before this letter? Yes. That's what happens in Acts. That's what I was describing to you in Acts. Paul founds the church in Philippi in Acts chapter, 2nd missionary journey, which is probably 52. Let's go see when it is. Second missionary journey, 50 to 53. So but still, that's 20 years before they even before they even hear the message. There's been 20 years. There's likely been people hear it around them. They may have heard something about it, but the church isn't founded until Paul gets there and founds the church in, call it 50, somewhere between 50 and 53.
It's just interesting how slow news spread back then without all the stuff we have today.
Well, understandable.
Well, I don't know I think that's an excellent comment, but I want you to think back. Well, maybe not you, Keith, but
I wasn't there,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I can tell you, I can remember a time when most communication was still done by, most communication like this, that was done by a letter. And if you mailed a letter from Durango, well, first of all, it didn't go to Albuquerque. But if you mailed a letter from Durango to, let's say, Cortez, let's say to Biloxi, Mississippi, that might be 4 or 5, 6 days before the letter's going to arrive there. My grandfather still worked for the Pony Express. He rode a Pony Express route from Farmington to Durango back in the day. So communication, agreed, communication doesn't happen like it does today. It happened over a long period of time. In this case, to get from Rome even to Philippi was probably a weeks, maybe a month-long journey just to get there.
Right. Like an Abraham Lincoln did the freedom of slaves in that period. It took a long time for that to get to the South and everywhere. So they knew it, right?
Yep.
It's not like, oh, Supreme Court decision, here it is, it's live on TV.
All you do is watch it. Yeah.
Yeah. It took months, maybe even a year. They're like, oh, what? He did what? When? That's just fascinating.
How many people were still fighting when the war was over?
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it took a while to say, hey, wait. Yeah. This has been over for a week, a month. What are you doing?
For those of you who are watching the video, we just spent some time on the Civil War. We'll move back to Paul's time, and the point that is being made is there was some time when this occurred between the time Paul writes it. Well, first of all, between the time Paul founds the church, we call it 52, the time he writes the letter, which is 8 years later, and the time that it finally gets delivered, who Epaphras is going to deliver. Paul in the letter, though, goes on to our next point, and that's going to be shining as stars, which is going to be verses 12 through 18. And then we're going to get to the last part of this that Keith just asked about, Timothy and Epaphroditus. So let's just read verses 12 through 18, and then we'll kind of dissect it. Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose. Do everything without complaining or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a crooked and depraved generation, in which you shine like stars in the universe as you hold out the word of life, in order that I may boast in the day of Christ, that I did not run or labor for nothing. But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me. So Paul's going to move into this section of what the church was, which were shining stars, and demonstrate for them what Paul himself has demonstrated for him. And you'll notice it starts out, therefore. So Paul desires the Philippians, and we're going to be in our work out your salvation verses here, 12 through 13, to respond positively to his admonition to have the mind of Christ, which he talked about back in verses 5 through 8. The command is to the entire group, since you here is plural. Now, I know we're having a lot of difficulty today trying to determine what pronouns are, but in this case, and in English, you is one word that can be either singular or plural. In Greek, this would have been understood as you plural, meaning all of you. So the subject is their mutual corporate salvation. And then he gets to the word work out. Now, many people are going to say, that means go figure out what your salvation is. That's not at all what it means, because you already know what your salvation is. What it means is to work for something. You might think of it more in terms of a workout at the rec center. You're exercising something that you already have. So the term speaks of present deliverance of the Philippians, and the word translated work out is used, and one of the best ways we can determine how it's used by a first century author to speak of digging silver out of silver mines. In other words, effort that you expend for something worth value. So salvation can be compared to a huge gift that needs to be unwrapped for one's enjoyment. That's what Paul's talking about. He's saying now finish up what Ephesians says when it says you have been saved by grace. Finish out what that says, because it goes on to say you have been saved in order to do good works. That's the point that Paul's making. But I do want to point this out. Paul is encouraging the Philippians to develop and work out their salvation, but not to work for their salvation. Does everybody understand the distinction? So the Philippians in verse 14 have been secretly discontented and have been complaining. If we go back to chapter 2, we see a little bit about that. But the word used suggests that any kind of loud dissent or dissension has not occurred yet. I want you to notice what happens in verse 14. He says, "Do everything without complaining or arguing." Now, likely that Paul has heard about some dissension in the church, and when we get to chapter 4, we're going to find where some of that dissension comes from. It's still relatively minor compared to what he tasked the Galatians with, or even the Colossians. He's saying, look, there's some hard spots in this religion, this new religion that you have, that need to be worked out. Why would that not be common in something as new as, when we just pointed out, this is only 30 years after the crucifixion? Why wouldn't there be rough spots or difficulties in the church? We don't have those today. We need the drum, don't we? The kind of da-da-da-da. Paul's simply saying there are going to be issues to work out, but work them out together as one group. In verse 15, the verse focuses on the testimony of the church. The purpose of the command in verse 14 is that the Philippians might be blameless light bearers in their world. If the Philippian believers were going to have a testimony in their community, they had to be blameless in their actions and attitudes, both inside and outside the church. I want that to sink in for just a minute, because what is it you hear from most people who denigrate the church?
They had a bad experience there.
And they may have a bad experience. They may not have had any bad experiences at all, but what they're going to say is, oh, they're all hypocrites. They do one thing and they act one way other. They say this, but they act differently. Now, I think that's people probably wanting that to be the case, but it's very rare that I've ever found anybody could give me an example. Oh, she'll prove it to me. But here's the reality. The church is not for saints. The church was for sinners, right? Now, ultimately, we're called saints because that just means those set apart. So the point is that the Philippians were going to have testimony in their community. Now, remember, this is largely a community that doesn't know anything about monotheism, and specifically God Yahweh. If the Philippian church is going to be able to demonstrate to what's going on in the community, they got to be able to do it through their actions, not just through their words. That's the same thing in our churches today, isn't it? Shouldn't it be, I recognize him by the fact of his actions. I think I may have used this example before, or I've had this dream. I haven't had it in a long time, which is good. That in this dream, I'm sitting in a chair back and reading the newspaper, back when they had printed newspapers. And I'm standing behind myself, watching myself read the newspaper. And in the newspaper is my obituary. And in the obituary, it says he was a Christian. And the me behind me, looking down on the chair, says, oh, I didn't know that. Can you imagine anything that would be worse in your obituary than to have people say, well, I had no idea? The point that Paul's making is the church should not only be testimony within the church, but also outside the church. And then when he says without fault, that's a technical word used to denote anything that is fit to be offered as a sacrifice, meaning without blemish or untainted by sin. Paul's point is, if you're going to take the name Christian, act like a Christian. And then he differentiates it in the very next term. Listen to what he says. And I think the King James does a great job of this. Look in verse 15 again. So that you may become blameless and pure, children of God, without fault, in a crooked and depraved generation. King James uses crooked, but it also says perverse generation. Paul describes the world as being the opposite of Christian. On the one hand, the world turned away from the truth, while on the other hand, it exerts a corrupting influence that is opposed to the truth. Now, once again, this was written 2,000 years ago. It has no application for today. Can't you, when we go through all of these, can't you just see exactly what Paul was talking about in today? Can't you see exactly what is happening in our society today can be called crooked and perverse? Paul says, act differently than that. And saints, the term saints actually means be set apart. Be set apart from what? Be set apart from a crooked and perverse generation. And then he goes on to say, the way you do that is you shine as lights. And he depicted believers as stars whose light penetrates the spiritual darkness of a perverted world. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. But he also says in Matthew 5, you are the light of the world. So Christ is inherently light. We are the light of the world as long as we reflect Christ.
I think it's good for perspective too, because people are like, oh, we're going to hell in a handbasket. Oh my gosh, Jesus is going back tomorrow. It's so bad. But you can go back in history, it's the same thing. They're writing this in 60 AD. Look at Babylon. Look at Noah flooded the earth in Genesis because people were so wicked. That was the first book in the Bible, man. It didn't take like 1,000 years, right? It was the first few generations.
Well, and actually, in the first, and actually, I believe both Paul and Peter believed that Jesus' return is going to be in their lifetime. You know what? Every generation since has believed the same thing.
Oh, my dad was the same way.
Well, we probably all. My dad was one of those that would say, first of all, who'll give a damn in 100 years? And his point was, we're not going to be here. And so secondly, what difference does it make? Every generation has thought this is going to be the end of time. I can tell you exactly this much, and that is, we're closer today than we were yesterday. We'll be closer tomorrow than we are today. That's as close as I'm going to get to telling you when it's going to occur. But if I show up next week and nobody is in this room, I'm going to have a little worry about the rapture.
You're going to work out your salvation.
That's right. I'm going to work double hard.
If you're not with us, I'll be really concerned.
Let's go on to verse 16. As you hold out the word of life, in order that I may boast on the day of Christ, that I did not run or labor for nothing. Now, the Greek term, when he says, as you hold out or hold on to, it's probably in the NIV it says hold on to. In King James, it's hold fast or hold on to. So the verb that's translated contains two thoughts. The first is this, holding fast and holding forth, in other words, holding on to. The former concept suggests a steadfastness in which our lights blaze continually for God. And the second, the latter concept implies projecting our lights into the darkness of the world. So look at verse 16 once more. As you hold out the word of life, in order that I may boast on the day of Christ. That word of life is going to be to hold on to it and to project it into the future. And then Paul uses these terms, that I did not run or labor in vain. Paul's going to use the concept a lot of running a race, and that's what he's going to talk about here. Run suggests energetic activity, and then while he labored indicates the toil of Paul's ministry, all of which goes back to the whole concept of working out one's salvation. And then in verse 17, being poured out, not uncommon for both Jews and Greeks to pour out wine on an altar in connection with a religious sacrifice. Now, some have said that Paul is alluding to his eventual death here. I think Paul knows that his time is going to be short, but I don't think that's what he's doing. The content of the letter reveals, by contrast, that Paul assumes he's going to live, if we just go back to verse 25 in chapter 1, and he expects to be released from prison shortly, which church tradition records that he was released. He was presently being poured out, could probably be better read as a living offering on behalf of the faith of the Philippians. So it shouldn't be read as he's pouring out his life, at least at this point. When we get to 2 Timothy, that's going to be a true statement. But here, Paul is saying this is the sacrifice in your behalf, and he's going to end it with service. Paul chooses a Greek term that depicts a person who fulfills the duties of a public office at his or her own expense. In the Christian context, this word speaks of worship humbly offered to God. So he ends this section by saying, in verse, let's start in verse 17, even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me. That's going to bring us to our last key verses, our last kind of verses of the day, and that's Timothy and Epaphroditus, verses 19 through 30. So Paul's going to shift now, and if we go back to our outline, in our Philippians outline, we've gone through, let's see if I can read it here easier. We've gone through, starts with the right attitude. We've gone through, maintained through right theology. And now we're in what I would call encouraged by the right models. And you'll notice on this outline, I've got some handouts. Ernie, you guys probably don't have them. I've got handouts, but it's also should be in what I sent you guys. You'll notice on the left-hand side, it has Christ at the top. So the way that Swindoll chose to use this is, first of all, our joy in serving Christ in unity, and then Christ is my model. Well, he's going to give you two more models here in Timothy and Epaphroditus. Now, I want to point something out here. Throughout all of these books, at the end of the book, Paul has said, through the prison letters, Paul has said, and in the beginning of some of them, as in this one, he says, from Timothy, he's going to name a number of individuals that are with him in house arrest in Rome. Now, I will make sure you understand this. This comes from the book of Tom. I think he's preparing for eventual leadership in the churches he's writing back to. In other words, Epaphroditus, once we get to Epaphroditus, we're going to find out that he eventually becomes the first bishop of Philippi. Timothy was one of the first people, in fact, that's one of the first churches Timothy goes into with Paul, is the church at Philippi. And it talks about that Timothy has a heart for Philippi and the Philippians for him. So throughout all of this, and I'm going to put together a list of all the people who are with Paul. We tend to think of Paul in prison by himself. He's not, at least at this case. In this point, Paul is under house arrest. Ultimately, he will be in the Mamertine prison. That's when he will be by himself, with the exception of possibly Luke and Timothy, who have to be outside the cell. In this case, he's got people surrounding him. And as I said, I believe it's that he knows his time is short, and he's preparing the churches for the next step in leadership. So let's just read, probably, might as well read all of it, verses 19 through 30. This is going to deal with Timothy and Epaphroditus. I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, but I also may be cheered when I receive news about you. I have no one else like him who takes a genuine interest in your welfare, for everyone looks out for his own interest, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know that Timothy has proved himself because he is a son with his father. He has served me in the work of the gospel. I hope, therefore, to send him to you as soon as possible, as soon as I see how things go with me. And I am confident in the Lord that I myself will come soon. Let's stop there, and we'll come back and deal with Epaphroditus here in just a minute. You notice at the beginning of the book, it says Paul and Timothy. Not likely that Timothy's a co-writer. Could have been the amanuensis. But he's saying, you already know Timothy. You know somebody who's been in your church. Timothy was with me when I met with you 8 years ago and we established this church. So Paul's going to balance his previous somber message that we had through verses 12 through 18 with the optimistic hope of sending his co-worker Timothy, whose name means one who honors God and was from a believing family. If we go back to, well, I would have to go to 2 Timothy, we're going to find that both Eunice and Lois, his mother and grandmother, had become Christians. That's how ultimately Timothy's going to be introduced to the church at Philippi. He was well loved by the Philippians and in turn exhibited a great concern for them, what we just read about in verses 20 through 22. In 22, Timothy had shown his faithful character both to the Philippians, who knew of his 10 years of ministry with the Apostle Paul. So he's saying, I'm going to send Timothy back to you, because obviously he can't. He's under house arrest. But you'll notice the attitude that he believes he's going to be released, which ultimately he will be. And he says, I want to send Timothy back to you, who he will. And he calls him his son. Now, in the New Testament times, a son served his father, and he did so to learn the family trade. Serving in this way meant learning all about the business and being willing to obey the teacher in order to become as skillful as possible in the same work. That really comes through. There's something called the pastoral epistles, and they are basically 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. They are separate epistles from the epistles that Paul writes because they are called pastoral, because they are Paul's method of saying, here's the training for both you, Timothy, and you, Titus, and what's going to happen when I leave. One of them, Timothy, will become the bishop at Ephesus. Titus will become the bishop at Crete, I believe. But both of them, Paul is saying, here's my sons, here's my trade, and here's how you are to apply it. In verse 24, notice what Paul says. And I am confident in the Lord that I myself will come soon. He's writing to the Philippians. He's saying, I'm going to come and see you soon. He's confident that he's going to be released from prison. No way to tell why he has such confidence, but ultimately he is. The decision at this point could go either way. Paul was still confident that release was imminent and that he would fulfill his wish to visit the Philippians. Acts doesn't record either the release or death of Paul, but evidence furnished in some of the early church writings supports the hypothesis of a release during which Paul did additional travel to Crete, Asia Minor, Macedonia, and Achaia. It's good reason, therefore, to believe that Paul realized what was going to occur does occur, and he does get back to the church at Philippi. We don't have anything about that in Acts. We don't have anything about that in Paul's writings. What we do have is later church writings, and the fact that the Philippian church grew and burgeoned after that period of time is kind of pretty good testimony. Ultimately, most believe Paul makes it to Spain, where he wants to be, before he ends up in the Mamertine prison. That's going to be, if Paul's writing this in 60, he's probably there for 2 years, 60, 62. He's not going to be imprisoned until probably 65, maybe 66, and likely beheaded in 67. So what happens in that period of time between the two? He's likely released from house arrest, is free to go. Then in 64 AD is when Rome burns. That's when Nero, the first huge persecution breaks out. That's when Nero says, it's the Christians who started the fire, so go kill all of them. That's when Paul's going to end up back in the Mamertine prison. But there's a period of anywhere from 2 to 4 years there where Paul is free to move about, maybe back to the church at Philippi. And that's going to bring us to, Keith, our discussion a few minutes ago about Epaphroditus. So start in verse 25. But I think it is necessary to send back to you Epaphroditus. If he's sending back to him, what does that mean? He's with Paul in Rome right now. My brother, fellow worker, and fellow soldier, who is also a messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs. For he longs for all of you and is distressed because you heard he was ill. Indeed, he was ill and almost died. But God had mercy on him and not on him only, but also on me, to spare me sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore, I am all the more eager to send him to you, so that when you see him again, you may be glad, and I may have less anxiety. Welcome him in the Lord with great joy, and honor men like him, because he almost died for the work of Christ, risking his life to make up for the help you could not give me. So, Epaphroditus, a couple things we should note, and we talked a little bit about this already. The name actually means belonging to Aphrodite. So Epaphroditus was, as were all the other converts in the Philippian church, was a Gentile, not only a Gentile, but might have practiced a pagan religion up until the time that the Holy Spirit works in his life. Ultimately, the church tradition says he becomes the first bishop at Philippi. So he's a Philippian Christian sent by the church of Philippi to take a gift. Remember, this whole letter is kind of a thank you note that the church at Philippi, and as far as we can tell, they're the only church to send like a care package to Paul while he's under house arrest. Notice how Paul talks about him. He says he's a brother, a fellow worker, a fellow soldier, a messenger to the Philippians, and a minister to Paul. This is the only place he's mentioned in the Bible. Mentioned twice in this book. It's the only place he's mentioned throughout the Bible. You'll notice also it says your messenger. The term that's used there is actually apostolos, which was typically reserved for the technical term of those who had a commission, had seen Christ face to face and had a commission from him. Paul's going to use this instead to say, I'm sending him, which is what apostolos means, the sent out one. So it's not used in the strictest sense of the word. And then he talks about sick almost unto death. Apparently, Epaphroditus, either on his journey or while in Rome, ended up with some kind of deadly disease, which Paul says he could have died. So the church at Philippi is concerned about him, and Epaphroditus is concerned about the church at Philippi. So Paul is saying now he is well, and I'm sending him back to you because you have more need of him than I do. And the expression in verse 28, I've sent, refers to his present sending of Epaphroditus with the letter. Now, by the time they receive the letter, sending is going to be in the past tense, but Epaphroditus is going to carry this very same letter that we're talking about to the church. Most of the letters were likely done as sermons in the church and then circulated throughout the church and other churches around them. And then finally in verse 30, not regarding his life, Paul informs the Philippians of the commitment that Epaphroditus had for the work that they had given him to do and to supply what was lacking. The one thing the Philippians couldn't do is be there with Paul. But they were willing to send, and at this point probably one of the mainstays of the church, Epaphroditus, to be there with them. So in all of this, what we've learned is pretty much what our outline. I better get to our right outline here.
At the end of 28,
Mm-hmm.
in the NIV version, mine says, therefore I'm eager to send him so that when you see him, you'll be glad, and I may have less anxiety. I being Paul, what does yours say?
Less sorrow.
Less sorrow.
What verse are you in, Keith?
28.
Therefore I am all the more eager to send him, so that when you see him again, you may be glad, and I may have less anxiety. What was the other one?
Less concerned.
Anxious.
Pardon?
Less anxious.
Less anxious or less sorrow?
Less concerned about you.
He's probably talking more about concern for Epaphroditus, because once Epaphroditus is back in Philippi, where the church can take care of him. He'll have less concern about him. That's the first thing. Second thing is, if Epaphroditus makes it back to the church, he's going to deliver this letter. So Paul wouldn't be as anxious about knowing how the church is doing. That's my guess.
Interesting adjective.
Yep.
Didn't Paul write, don't be anxious to anything, but everything through prayer and supplication?
Yeah.
And he's
Well-
doing his own work.
Don't we all? So let's go back to where we kind of opened up today in terms of what Paul is saying in chapter 2. And again, I can't stress enough the joy of the letter. As I said, it's used the term joy, or a related term, is used some 16 times in this letter. And once again, very different from most of what we've seen, haven't it? When we read Galatians and Colossians, and Ephesians to some degree, Paul's taking him to task. Not so much here. Next week, he is going to talk to him a little bit about something called antinomianism, which we'll talk about. And he's going to talk again to some degree about Judaizers, but very minor compared to what he dealt with the other churches. So and if you look at the top of the outline, he starts with the right attitude, maintained through the right theology, which he expresses when he talks about the incarnation of Jesus, and then finally encouraged by the right models. And the right models here would have been Paul, Timothy, and Epaphroditus. And Paul's going to say, in the next chapter, he's going to say, imitate what it is I do. He's not saying imitate me because I'm so good. He's saying, imitate me because this is the life of Christ. So next week, then, we'll get to a joy in knowing Christ. There'll be a warning when we talk about antinomianism and Judaizers. There's going to be a testimony, there's going to be a goal, and there's going to be a command. So we'll do that next week. And then, depending on how efficient we are, we may try to finish chapter 4 as well, but it's more likely it will be next week for chapter 3, following week for chapter 4, and then we get summer recess. Questions, comments, thoughts? None of the above?